Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our first event of the spring. It is a pleasure to welcome Mora, NABI, and Sean Boyd back to AUD. Both Mora and Sean graduated from a MMARC program in 2012. I'm not sure, I should have asked this when we were talking before, but did you meet here or at Berkeley? Oh, okay. So what I wrote is like, I'm not sure that we can claim that they met here, as they both attended Berkeley as undergraduates, Mora for architecture and Sean not for architecture, put it like that. But I like to think that the imagining of a shared architectural project and the first steps towards giving that project some shape emerged somewhere in this building. Upon graduation, Mora and Sean spent time in the offices of Frank Gehry and Paul Nogues, and Sander and Greg's office, respectively. And it's interesting to look at those references and the impact they might have had in shaping the core interests and methods of their own practice. Their work has been described as, and I quote, both precise and playful, with a thoughtful approach to each project that has a softness and ease with sight, while reimagining the terms of context and material. I would add to that a contemporary project with references to both Americana and California architectural traditions, with careful attention to materials and a clear love for craft. It is in the intersection of those ideas that we can see how the project brings together tradition and contemporaneity that their projects find a new expression. To use the Shepherd Mesa House as an example, the project combines a formal language that is traditionally part of the iconography of the domestic with a material resolution and a suite of details that engage the California context, geography and climate, and a contemporary material language. Their work highlights pressing concerns in contemporary architecture like sustainability, urban density, technological change, and material innovation, to name a few. These issues are not abstract in their work. They define the environments they design and the models of inhabitation they propose, shaping a practice that engages both the spatial and the cultural dimensions of an architectural project. There are a few words they use to describe their own work: thoughtful, simple, warm, and light, but encouraging the wild, playful, and curious. I love that, by the way, good collection. This seems like an elegant and carefully conceived framework to produce an architectural project of our time and of the future. Over the past few years, NABI BOYD has been recognized with many awards, including the 2021 AIA Next LA Residential Architecture Award for Los Osos Cranas House, the 2021 AIA LA Residential Architecture Award for Shepherd Mesa House, and the 2021 Best of Design Young Architects winner by the Architects newspaper, to name a few. And they are just getting started. Please join me in welcoming Mora and Sean back to you.
Thanks very much. We're excited to be here as alumni, but also frequent attendees of lectures here. So usually we have to park way down the hill and walk up the hill, and we're out of breath by the time we get here. So it was nice to cruise over from parking lot 3 tonight. And then you also stole my line, because I was going to say we actually met for the first time in this very room. So this place is pretty important to us.
So we met in 2009, but what really brought us together was a studio during our 3rd year that Ben Ball and Gaston Nogues taught about designing public bathrooms. Our first assignment was to cut this toilet and urinal in half, which was, if you can imagine, like totally a nightmare. It took us literally the whole class days to cut through these 2 things. But, you know, here you go. This is what a toilet and a urinal look cut in half, if you ever wondered. This image is not a commentary on the studio, because I went on to work for Ben and Gaston after school. And Ben actually just got us a new job, which we want to say thanks to Ben. So yes, I took my cutting things in half skills over to Paul Nogues after we graduated. And Sean worked for Lynn until we started NABI BOYD.
When we were putting our website together at that time that we started, we realized we had to write an about page for ourselves. And we only had one completed project at that point. So we essentially described that one project in broad terms, and that became what we were about. Getting ready for this lecture was another chance to kind of stop and lift our heads up and see what we've been up to. We noticed that we pretty much only work on houses. They're all in Southern California, maybe some in Central California, depending on how you define that. Not all of them, but a large percentage of them are in more rural areas and sometimes agricultural. They're mostly for people who are going to live in those houses for a long time. And they're often houses that are already there, and we're trying to make them better. Our first project was a ground up project on an empty acre. And our second project before it died was another ground up project. At that time, we thought we had somehow skipped the well-worn path of young architects through dozens of remodels. Those turned out to be pretty fluky, those ground up projects, because we since then been working on mostly existing houses. The houses we work on come to us as rather anonymous buildings. Often there was no architect. A few times the original owner had designed the house themselves. There's usually a client whose life doesn't exactly fit into the current version of the house, and they want us to help them find a better fit. Sometimes that involves making the house bigger. Once it involves making the house smaller. Sometimes it just involves making use of what's there. Sometimes people come to us and they've just bought a house and have some budget to put into it, and they don't know what to do with it. And we tell them just to hire a landscape architect. We told the landscape architect that, and she said that sometimes she tells people to just buy a big tree. So that's what this is. So we're going to be talking about some of our ongoing projects, some things that are under construction now, a couple of projects that didn't make it out of the computer, and some completed work as well. Hopefully we can give you an idea of how a small, youngish architecture firm is navigating running a practice in Southern California. All of our building projects are client-based, which is sometimes easy to forget when someone presents their work, that there's a whole separate, seemingly anonymous party that's intimately involved in all of this. So we work all over Southern and Central California. So we find ourselves driving around a lot. Also, our families live in California, but not in LA, so we're always driving to see them. Sometimes these visits double up with projects we're working on, sometimes not. Driving is important to us because we can look at things and we can talk about things uninterrupted. We rarely take the fastest route when we're driving, so we try to see things every time we're going somewhere. And a slightly embarrassing fact about the two of us is that in 12 years of being together, we've never been on an airplane together. We did go to Hawaii once, but we took separate planes. But we probably have at least 100,000 miles driving in a car together. This is more driving on a beach when you used to be allowed to do that. So these next photos we're flipping to are mostly things we've stumbled upon while driving, anonymous, ad hoc, not really architecture per se, but important to us. This is a part of a jetty in Los Angeles. This is some kind of drainage wall in Joshua Tree. These are greenhouses in Carpinteria, different styles of construction from kit built to just draped plastic to fabric on poles. This is an expansion loop in pipeline in Oxnard. And this is, we think, some kind of water storage. This one might be familiar. It's an airplane hangar in Santa Monica. And this is a restroom in Death Valley. And this is a greenhouse in Oxnard. And we took this picture years ago, but just noticed this when we were putting this talk together, which we thought was kind of bizarre. Yeah. And here's another. So speaking of Venturi, architects have written extensively about the value of the ordinary. There's obviously some of that going on here, but we like to think of these buildings as serving very specific purposes for a specific site. We're interested in how they sit in the landscape, how they deal with material and light, how they deal with budgets even. There's also something slightly odd about these buildings that we like. Maybe the proportion is not what you get in a design space. We try to learn from these places and buildings when we can.
So this leads us into a personal research project that we've been working on, and it's still ongoing. Maybe it's not such a radical idea for an office that mostly works on houses, but we're finding that there's this strong component of family, generations, life phases, and histories in this project. So on the right is a photo of my family home in Afghanistan. I was born in Kabul and moved to California when I was 3. Sean was born in Carpinteria up the coast about an hour and a half. This is a photo on the left of where he grew up. Obviously, these photos are quite different, but they both start to talk about the idea of working within a region. These houses are long-term projects, life projects. The owners are constantly working on them, and they're never quite done. So I learned later in life that my grandfather and uncles had built our family home in Kabul, and I was fascinated by this and started thinking more deeply about our relationship to this house now. This is a photo right after they had moved in. So the house is gone now. Even locating it in Google Maps was a process, but when we did find the location, there's a different building where it used to be. All we really have to go off of are about 6 photographs and the memories of my mom and dad, my uncles, my aunt, my grandmother. So we started asking ourselves, what did it mean for my family to design and build their own house in Kabul? What did it mean to leave forever? What do they remember? How are these memories different? How are they the same? So these are a series of site plans that came out of just some initial interviews with some family members that are starting to map things out. The black massing is the house, and the perimeter is the wall that bounds the property. My mom remembered the landscape twice as big as the house and with both a front and backyard. My uncle initially remembered this differently, a side yard entry with a much deeper front yard. My other uncle was somewhere in the middle. The common thread was this strong presence of a garden and these 3 apple trees. These differences intrigued us, and it started to show the subjective nature of what we were working on. So it wasn't until I started sharing images and information between everyone that a clearer, more agreed upon version began to emerge, which is what you see here. There's also a well and kind of like a winter bathroom on the site, which you can see had these deep penetrations through the land. So it's sort of become this reverse process of designing a house. Where we're at now is some collective version checked against photos, but the assumptions that I brought to, as well as that I've brought to the reconstruction. And there's information here about local construction methods, about the social dynamic of the house and the garden and so forth. And we know it's not the exact thing, but it's some shared version, which is possibly better. And so now we're wondering where this goes and what we'll do with it. Rugs have a deep history in the domestic landscape of Afghanistan. People sit on them, they sleep on them, they pray on them. Rugs are often these objects that are passed down generation to generation. So we're looking at creating a rug from these memories. Here's an early sketch. We like this way of remembering the house. So here's a current, yeah, so with this idea of shaping a home, we wanted to turn to one of our current projects that are under construction in Montecito Heights called the Hero Residence. This is a project that started as a tiny addition to a small hillside home. We thought it was a good omen when this guy showed up in Street View to greet us when we started initially researching the property. So because of the specifics of the site and the zoning code, we were only allowed to add about 60 square feet to the house, which would fill that tiny little gray rectangle in the existing plan. The 60 square feet would aim to free up a tight ground floor plan that was already just big enough for a kitchen and a living room, but not quite big enough for anything else. Our design moved the existing stairs into what was previously the side yard cutout. The new location would give some breathing room to the kitchen, and we could slide in a dining table and built-in bench under the stairs. The stairs would no longer exit into like an awkwardly placed column. But in the middle of permitting, the clients got pregnant, which was a nice surprise, of course. But as we got closer to construction and they got closer to having a baby, priorities changed, understandably. The addition would have to be scrapped. So now here we are back to the existing plan, but they still wanted to see if they could fit a dining table. We were stuck with the column and stuck with the stairs, and we had to find room where there wasn't any. So here's the current proposed plan. At the plan level, not that much has changed. So you see here in this diagram, the whole lower landing now becomes a kind of connected piece of furniture. The inconveniently located column is still there, but it becomes a table leg. The landing doubles as a bench to sit on, and the table can act as a sort of guardrail for the landing. We also snuck some storage in there. And we just love this Jasper Morrison vanity shower dinner table. It's kind of doing the same thing. And here's a little homage to Morrison's line drawing style. And then the library of the various Doug fir wood cuts that showed up in the project, mixed grain, end grain, rotary cut. And here you see a view coming down the stairs, looking at the table off the edge of the landing. We wanted this to feel like a piece of furniture. So we're playing up certain details like the box joint on the stairs and the exposed mortise on the table. Here's the bench for the table with the kitchen beyond. And then here's the whole chunk. We still get a cutout under the stairs, but now it's a day bed with a porthole. There's some budget left over for other things. In the end, we like this new, smaller version better, and the roundabout process allowed us to find a space where we didn't see it before. Also, just a side note, they had their baby, and his middle name is Coyote, which we really like. Okay, so Ojai House. Just a note about the naming of our projects. So we started naming our projects by street names, and this seemed like a perfectly functional way of keeping track of projects in our office. Our first real project was on Shepherd Mesa Road, so we called it Shepherd Mesa House, which seemed perfectly fine. Since then, we've run into a number of confusing duplicates that seem almost impossibly coincidental. We've had Foothill Road in Carpinteria, but then we got a project in Ojai on a different Foothill Road, so we just called that one Ojai House, because that didn't seem likely that we would get another Ojai project. But then we did get another Ojai project, and then we call that one Sierra Road House. But then recently we got a project on Sierra Bonita in LA. We ended up getting two different projects on Baylord Ave and Carpinteria, but what's even more confusing is that one of the family's last name is Baylord. We have a project on Ocean View Ave in Santa Barbara, but then one of our clients who lives on Ocean View Ave in Mar Vista. Anyway, it's a mess and it's getting a little annoying, and we can see why people call things House 1, House 2, etc. So Ojai House, not Foothill House, came to us as a work in progress. The 2-bedroom 1970s house sits on a cut and fill pad on a steep slope in the over the Ventura River Valley. So you can see the house sits on a large lot, just over an acre, but only about 20% of that area is flat and buildable. So you really are back closer to a standard suburban lot size. This is one of those situations where once you include area for a septic system plus setbacks, you're actually quite hemmed into your acre lot. Also, any added bedroom or even a single added plumbing fixture would have triggered a full septic upgrade, which could have been prohibitive. So this became one of these projects where we tried to leave the footprint alone and just work with what's there. It's an extreme site, and like with that just comes these pretty spectacular views. So the clients had started a partial remodel on their own that you see here, but realized in the process that they needed help. And they had already opened up the south west corner of the home to the house that we just showed, but the rest of the house remained awkwardly laid out, and we were asked to create a flexible space for them that gave the large primary bedroom and office space for just the two of them, but then could transform into a functional two-bedroom with visual, acoustical privacy when guests came to stay. So with the big view more or less solved and already paid for, we left the southwest corner alone. Here's the proposed plan. We imagine the house as a transformable space with two large parketing walls, doing the work of pushing and pulling the levels of privacy. With the walls open, the couple lives in a space where privacy isn't a concern. With the walls closed, the house becomes essentially two primary suites. The owners and guests can do their own thing in privacy and reconvene in other areas of the house. We're also struck by the looming hillside behind the house. You can see the tight topography lines here. So with the west-facing doors taking advantage of the expansive views, we became interested in the backside. We wondered if we could take advantage of a comprehensive view as well, or a compressive view as well. We wanted to see if we could visually bring a chunk of the hillside into the house. So we cut out a portion of the wall and lifted the roof up to give this elevational view of the topography and the landscape and the interior space. So here's what that looked like in construction. It looks extra dramatic here without the roof, but you can imagine with the roof back on, it's kind of the slice of the hillside and their dining room. We're also learning that we'll always be at the whim of nature on our projects. This project has been slowed down by a landslide that happened during last year's rains. When we scheduled this lecture in July of last year, we were sure this project would be finished by now. Of course, it's not, and hence all the unfinished construction photos. But we wanted to run through some of these things that we've been talking about so you can see how they've taken shape. Here's that idea of the pocketing walls opening and closing to transform the functionality of the house. Here's what we're calling the dormer that grabs the hillside view. Sadly, the windows still have the film and stickers, but we're still waiting for that moment to unveil. We like that it differentiates the ceiling and the space as well, breaking up the typical ranch style roof that was already on the house. We also have this hallway. It's kind of a dark space with a tiny skylight shaft that creates this break from the brightness of the rest of the house. Ojai gets very hot, and we like that there are some darker areas in the house. A view from the kitchen looking toward those pocketing doors. A couple moments highlighting the woodwork. It was a bit of a battle to convince our contractor to use Doug fir, that it was an okay choice for the walls and cabinetry. He kept calling it shit wood. And I think by the end, he came around, especially when he invented a name for the architectural style, which was Alps Contempo, which we thought was hilarious. Here's the bathtub and a corner window. The window on the left is an interior window into the bedroom. This was a way the rooms could share the view. This is the view they're sharing. On the outside, it's more or less what was there, but we extended the eave for shade and added new finishes. Here's the dormer. So about 3 hours southeast of Ojai, we're now in Riverside. Riverside Farm is a project we're currently working on. It's a 5-acre citrus orchard with an existing post and beam house from the 1960s, designed by the architect Clinton Marv. We're remodeling, restoring, and adding into the house. The project will restore the property into a home that is part residence, part retreat, part working orchard. This is Riverside in the 1800s. Some small parts of it don't look very different from this now. Riverside is known as the birthplace of California's citrus industry. And even though it's now the 12th most populous city in California, the citrus orchards are still a part of the landscape of the city. This is the first navel orange tree in America, which you can still see today behind a fence across from a Baskin-Robbins. So part of what allowed Riverside to grow all this citrus is the Gage Canal that brings water from the Santa Ana River about 10 miles away. The canal runs along the east edge of the property and provides water directly to the orchard. This is an aerial view of the existing property. About 2/3 of the property is citrus trees and then gives way to the residence and its amenities. In between the house and the orchard is an existing barn that bridges the two programs of the site. The project involves a restoration in addition to the house, plus some gentle interventions. The restoration includes recording what's original, addressing how to reconstruct things in a way that is authentic to the house, but still works with today's more stringent code requirements. For example, where new and old windows meet, and sourcing materials that aren't available anymore. So Clinton Marr, the architect, he was born and raised in Riverside, but he went to school at USC, and A. Quincy Jones was his teacher, Pierre Koning and Frank Gehry were his classmates. So he studied architecture with all these LA luminaries, but then he decided to go back to Riverside in the 60s and practice there. He designed a number of locally iconic buildings around the building. This is a church in Riverside. For us, this is the first time we've worked on a house that brings with it somewhat documented architectural history. In theory, this history shouldn't necessarily change how we work on a house, but in reality, it's a little stressful. We're at least somewhat relieved and encouraged by a quote we found from Clinton Marr talking about remodeling homes. He says, sure, people want to modernize them, and of course, bringing the kitchens and bathrooms up to date, present day standards, and that is understandable. So we felt like we had at least some sort of blessing from him. So looking at the floor plan of the main residence, you can see that the house is organized as a long bar with two arms branching off. There are two wings that create private quarters, and the bedrooms are stacked in the east wing of the main bar. Here's the roof plan where you can see everything is housed under one connected roof. And as an aside, the home was originally designed for and built for Jack Yeager, who owned one of the largest highway construction companies in the country. He lived in the house from the 60s to when he died in 2016. The scale and layout of the house start to make some sense when we found out that the owner built freeways. It's not a huge house, but it's 175 feet to walk from one end to the other. One of the things that makes this project so special is all of the redwood that's used throughout. Apparently, Yeager brought a lumber mill to the property, and he would mill down full redwood logs on site. It's been a challenge adding on to the house while trying to keep this material continuity when the material isn't readily available anymore in this form, and the quality of the house does require it. So we uncovered things like this 3-inch thick redwood T&G roof decking and full 6x10 redwood beams hiding under the deck. One way we've been starting to extend the redwood on the house is by pulling it from places where it wasn't visible, for instance, in the attic, and then using it in places in the addition that required new exposed wood. So it's all post and beam construction with direct set glass and old growth redwood ceilings and walls. And these are some recent images of the construction progress. Here's a portion of the eave at the addition area. This is one of those areas where we are able to pull the redwood material from the attic space and use it in an exposed area of the addition. Just a few more photos from the exterior showing the construction progress. So a quick note about the pool on the right, which is a more recent addition to the property. It was based on an Arto Sari kidney pool in the middle. Arto is a professional skateboarder, and his pool is designed specifically for skateboarding, although it holds water and works as a pool as well. Arto is Finnish, and we like that his pool is based on Alvar Aalto's pool on the left, which is considered to be the first kidney-shaped pool. And then just some of the materials emerging and just development of the kind of color palette that we're distributing. And then ending here with a rendering of the new kitchen, we had to decide where to be precious with maintaining the existing, but also decide where the house could be updated and modernized. It wasn't necessarily about fidelity to what was there, but more about something that could feel like it belonged.
So going through our photos as we were putting this lecture together, we noticed a lot of these types of photos. It's usually a disembodied hand holding some small thing up to gauge the relationship of one thing to another and get some gut reaction. One of us holding, the other reacting. It reminded us that we take a lot of these photos, but we rarely refer back to them because the decision is already made in the moment. Most of these photos are interiors related, which ends up being a good chunk of our work. If we're leaving a house with 80 to 90% of its existing walls, then the interiors and finishes become a large part of our scope. At this point, it's become a little hard for us to tell where the architecture stops and the interior begins. This last one is what happens when you have your client's material shots down and everybody wants to get their attention. We forgot to mention, we called this lecture 5.5 California houses, and this is the half house because it's an ADU. So that's the joke. So this next project is an ADU in Los Osos near Mora Bay. It was designed for a mother/grandmother who was moving onto the property with her son and his family. The existing house is screened by a tight row of cypress trees and was designed in the 1950s with this board and batten craftsman style. So for us, this project was about negotiating the desire for both privacy and access on a single property and creating a family compound and working with the wall that separates the two. A little sketch Mora did. So the new dwelling divides off about 20% of the lot. The west wall forms a fence and creates a clear privacy break between the two homes. The main residence is left with ample front and backyard space while the ADU has a private garden of its own. Here's the plan where you can see how the fence becomes the wall and then back to fence again. It's a simple one-bedroom plan that's private unto itself, but within it's a very open experience for the client. So the wall creates separation, but it's also the place where the two spaces come together and share something. The two-sided fireplace is either a gathering place for everyone at once outside or a divided amenity that can be used simultaneously. Here's a view of the private courtyard and entryway. The sliding gate really announces itself as open or closed, which can be used as a sort of signal of come on in or leave me alone. And the main living space is split into a sitting room and a 1.5 height flexible space that can be used for lounging, stretching, occasional painting lessons, and the operable clear story windows bring in light throughout the day and flush out heat in the summer months. So as a priority for the client, a bathtub with a light well and adjacent window connect the space to the outside. The bathroom is large for the house, but we should mention that the client had MS. And for her, one of the effects of the illness was that she didn't like wearing clothes. So one of the only places she felt comfortable was in a bathtub. So to her, this was the most important part of the house. So then outside shower against the bathtub and the window. Just a kind of postscript on this project. We're finding that as more and more of these properties are built out with multi-generational functionality, we're seeing more of this need for a negotiation of privacy within the property. These are things that you're usually having to work out with your neighbors or through a given planning code, but now it's within your family, and that's creating some interesting opportunities and discussions for ourselves and for homeowners. You might not be allowed to build a 10-foot fence between you and your neighbor, but you actually can between you and your in-laws. And sometimes it's the in-laws that request it. So just like breaking in here again, we wanted to talk about some like small scale things that we work on. The architecture process is so slow that it's nice to have these things that can happen on a different timeline. They kind of move with the momentum of construction, so there's more of a feeling of direct action. There are things that we fiddle around with in the office, so we're not really sure where they will go. These are 3D printed metal prototypes of some sort. Not sure what to do with them yet, but maybe they can become a table. This is a turned oak guardrail that came out of discussion with the fabricator on site during construction. Some custom cabinet handles that we're working on. Testing some painting strategies on OSB. These are dry vases that we designed to highlight and uncover the grain patterns of Doug fir lumber. This is a curved beam running through a skylight. So you'll see many of these are made out of wood because on a construction site, it's the most readily available material. There isn't necessarily a welder on site every day, but almost every day there's an extra piece of wood lying around and someone who can cut it with a skill saw and sand it. So then jumping up in scale and complexity here, but this is a Murphy bed that we designed with a large swing door that creates privacy in an open loft. Next project is called Sierra Road House, and it's in Ojai as well. And so this is a good example of one of these projects that arrives to us as an aging house that has reached the end of its current life phase. Sometimes the new owner buys it for the property or the location, and the house itself is secondary. The original owner of this house was a firefighter who designed the home himself, which isn't surprising when you see this elevation that looks like a fire station. So this is the plan we inherited. As this large monolithic rectangle, the plan would have benefited from some landscape cutting into it, creating more private gardens within the footprint. But that type of intervention was beyond the scope of the project. But we continued with this idea of private gardens. Instead of pushing into the plan, they push off. So this creates a layering of privacy that we liked for the house, which sits on a large lot, but faces in a rather awkward, cockeyed direction towards neighbors on either side. So we have these arms coming off the house, and they grab things from the landscape and sort of claim them for the house. We could, by doing this, we could leave the footprint of the house as it was, but enlarge the feeling of it by creating these in-between indoor and outdoor areas. There are 3 private or semi-private gardens, one at the entry, one off the primary bathroom, and one outside the guest suite / family art studio. So here's a view of the exterior. We kept the hip roof, which the client pretty much hated, but we sort of convinced him to keep it. And so then you see one of these arms at the front wrapping around an existing pepper tree. Here's a closer view of the house. The round window looks into that shared art studio. This is the front door and entry courtyard. We like that the new walls mark the entry and obscure it at the same time. And this is the enclosed garden in the back, which became an extension of the primary bathroom. It borrows shade from the existing sycamore tree just outside. And just the view of the interior, we're vaulting the ceiling and revealing the volume of the existing roof above. Open door leads into that art studio. So as we started with our most current project, we'll end it with our earliest project. Shepherd Mesa House is a house we designed on a cherimoya orchard in Carpinteria. It was an undeveloped interior lot when we started. In case you don't know, cherimoya is a South American fruit, and it just happens to grow very well in Carpinteria, so they're kind of all over there. So one of the difficulties with building a house on a working orchard, and I think we've done 3 different orchard projects now, but one difficulty is that the owners usually want to save as many trees as possible, and they also want to keep them alive, producing fruit for as long as possible. Unfortunately for the architect, this means that it's really hard to tell anything about the site because you're always staring at the side of a tree. Here's Mora trying to get her bearings. So eventually they agreed to trim back enough branches so we could get some idea of what the view would be like from the ground. And so the diagram for the house is that it's a single-story building that follows the slope of the property down the hill, and all of the interior program is collected under a large gable roof. Early on, the clients told us that they wanted to be able to step out onto the ground from every level. Looking back, this was maybe a strange request, but this connection to the ground really ended up shaping the project. Our architect friend Tim said the house looked like a shoe. He sent us this sketch, which we thought was kind of nice. So here's the house starting to evolve from the diagram. At certain times of year, the cherimoya trees really do look like these kind of perfect lollipop spheres. Just before construction started on the house, the Thomas fire came within a few 100 feet of the property. And this is an image looking up towards the hills behind the house. We were scheduled to give this lecture in early January this year until it was postponed because of the Palisades and Eaton fires. We didn't know while we were putting this presentation together the first time that this image would mean what it means to LA now. And here we are a few months later, and it feels like a completely different environment to speak about residential architecture. We were going to walk you through the fire-resistant components of this house, the non-combustible materials, the lack of eaves, a concrete and gravel buffer, but it feels a little oversimplified after watching the fires rip through LA. Transitioning back to the house, this was always an awkward transition to go from the fire, but here we are. Just before construction started on the house, so construction started back on the house, and we were lucky that the fire stopped where it did. And construction on many of our projects is a family affair. The clients were living on the property in a trailer, and they were also acting as owner builder on the project. Here's Ava on the right, testing out the soil. This is the homeowner, Brian, on the left, after the crawl space flooded, and he had to get in his wetsuit and snorkel around the vents. He was not happy with us. Luckily, I've known Brian since we were like 0, so he couldn't be too mad at us. More construction site as playground photos. So this is Brian's dad, Paul, who was kind of the GC as well. So the girls let Mora use their crayons to mark out for the builders how the siding would lap onto the stem wall. And here's the house starting to take shape behind the cherimoya trees. And then this is the floor plan. So it's 2 shifted bars separated by an oversized stairway that's big enough to be its own room in a way. And the more public parts of the house are at the highest level and have views above the cherimoya trees. And the more private parts of the house are nestled down into the orchard. All of the windows are square and placed to frame specific views. And these are some photos of the finished house. This is the approach and entry. You can see the view beyond. It's a photo of the bedrooms kind of spilling down the slope. These bedrooms are actually a few feet below grade, so you get this kind of interesting view out. Again, the bedrooms flowing down with the hill. And we like this photo with no windows. It feels like it could be some anonymous building, something maybe that we would stop and take a picture of on the side of the road. This part of the house shows the skill of the roofer who also did all the standing seam siding. It was a bit like watching a tailor work. It was really impressive. Kind of just like took this thing and created something much better out of it. So we're always thankful to his craftsmanship. Yeah, some interior views. And then this is a view up the hill towards the house through the trees. If you're working in the orchard, this is what you see. We like that as you get deeper and deeper into the orchard, you see the house less and less. It's actually pretty easy to get lost in the orchard there. And finally, this is a twilight photo of the house from a drone. Not a view that you'd ever really get because you're 200 feet off the ground, but we were looking at this in our Rhino model for years, so it's familiar to us. And that seemed quick, but that's all we have. So thanks for listening.
They should show a diversity of different sketches for like you created some of the sort of grand squiggles or something or more detailed isometric drawings. How do these different sort of mediums inform the progressive creative process? Is it like a sort of linear chronology of like you start out very abstract and you get more specific? Is it like more creative?
Feels like a Mora question.
Yeah, it's definitely not chronological. It's like a very, 2 steps forward, like 5 steps back, kind of constantly shifting in between. And I think just our background in working I was at Bell Nogues and Frank Geary's office, Sean was at Greg Lynn's. There's just such a flexibility that you needed to work across different mediums, across different building material types. And so for us, it's like we're usually thinking about what's the most efficient kind of method to express an idea between us, between a client, between the city, and to use that. They're all tools, are all up for grabs. Yeah.
Like the work is so beautiful and the economies in it are so striking and so well utilized. I kept thinking, what did we teach them? You didn't do a single family house in school. I don't think we teach that.
Actually, we did. We did. Steelhouse was if you remember that studio Steelhouse.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for me, that was my favorite class. So I don't know, it kind of makes sense that this is what we're doing.
So you actually feel like there's a kind of connection back to your training.
Yeah.
I wonder, I feel like now we look at the single family house and rural settings and think, who's got that kind of elbow room? No one has those kind of sites, and yet you sort of unearthed all these places. Does it feel like you're traveling down old California? It sort of looks like it from the 1800s to the 1950s is your geography and time period. And how does that shape the way you think about things you'll do future?
Yeah, I think for me, it's a lot of these places are in like Ojai, Carpinteria, Santa Barbara, and that's where I grew up. So it's feels kind of de rigueur for me, and maybe to Mora, it's a little different, but
yeah,
like my parents don't own an orchard, but their house is surrounded by an orchard. So I don't know, these orchards, yeah, they feel like home to me. So
yeah, and I think just to your question about working on houses, I think after we graduated, we were so curious about other things that we could visit, like buildings that we could see in LA. There's so many houses. Those are our buildings that are really kind of, you can talk about the history of LA through houses. And so that I think shaped just kind of this interest in working on at this scale. And I think I think a lot of people when they're starting out, it's houses. It's a very natural place to begin. And I don't think we would be working on stuff like this if we were, somewhere else, like New York or in a very urban, like it just wouldn't be there. So a lot of it's just like, because we're here, we have the opportunity to.
It's kind of funny. I feel like when I was in school and I would talk to someone who wasn't an architect, wasn't in school, they would always ask you, what do you do, commercial or residential? And as a student, you're like, that's a stupid question. I do both. Like everyone does both. And then, after school, like I actually have a single answer to that question. So,
Yeah.
Thank you both for the beautiful presentation. I know you said it was maybe over simplified to talk about this, but I'm curious what your fire resistance strategies are and maybe how they've begun to change since, recent ones.
Yeah, I mean, so on that house, it was all metal siding, metal roof. There's no attic space. It was all spray foam insulation. So there's no attic vents. We actually placed a number of like oversized hose bibs around the property, so you could kind of hook a fire hose up kind of anywhere around.
Yeah, the homeowner wanted to be able to protect the site himself if it ever got to that. So he had that placed around the property to be able to do that should he need to. There's also just some of the stuff with the landscaping. There's kind of a gravel boundary and concrete boundary directly against the house. And I think as Sean said, it's like working with non-combustible materials and really closing off the house from opportunity of embers coming in. And so not having eaves, not only, there's things you can talk about, about the form of it and what that all means. But I think there's a very practicality to it too. You don't have to now detail around how to have an eave that's not vented that you would normally vent and that kind of thing.
In terms of how it's changed, I don't know. We're working on a house in the Palisades, actually like pre-fire, and it was in permitting. And it was actually a garage conversion to an ADU. So the garage burned down and the house did not burn down. And it's one of these things where it's like the only house left on the whole block that didn't burn down. And I don't know, there's kind of wasn't a lot of rhyme or reason to it. There was like a big wood pergola on the roof that's fine. Like literally everything around is burned up. I mean, this house didn't have an attic either. So I think that's something. There was really nowhere for the embers to get in.
I mean, I think the thing that we're thinking about too is like, there's a lot of things that made this project that helped the client deal with the economy of like what it means to build a house, because it was self-built. They were the GC and they did as much of it as they can. And so as we think about it, I mean, the cost of housing, just the cost of construction is so high. And to build with these types of materials and introduce these kinds of details, it's just, starting to raise, you can't just keep adding things that are going to cost more money. So I think it's addressing it in ways that can be achieved, not through just monetary and the insulation we use is like a really expensive type of insulation and we've had to cut it out of other projects. So yeah, it's complicated. I think yeah.
I'm just curious about both of your backgrounds and the precision and technology that you come from, and the precision in the projects where everything seems aligned to like 4-inch center lines, it's ultra precise. And I'm just curious where you are in terms of fabrication and manufacturing, and if that precision is built in before you start construction, or if you're still very involved in how the houses get built and making sure that fabrication is precise and all of those alignments are there, because it just seems highly, highly rigorous.
Well, thanks. I thought you were going to go the other way. Okay. It was no longer precise.
That's going to be my question.
Yeah, I think that it's being involved during construction, and it's just kind of having standards that we learned from people like you. So yeah, I think if we're not involved during construction, the projects just turn out completely different than
Horrible. It's really difficult, and maybe that's because we haven't. I think there are things that we can do too. That maybe there is a process for doing that where you can just back off. But we are very involved during construction, and I think in the making of the thing. I mean, we're not physically, like, our background that did involve like being the one who's actually making it, and you're not having to produce drawings to explain it to someone else. You're creating just a fabrication drawing to build it for yourself. You have all of the information. So that's been a challenge, you know, to communicate it to someone else and to take it to that level of like documentation, which was kind of unfamiliar to us just in what we're previously doing before. So I think
it's not like just get the G code for yourself and walk over to the CNC.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, it shows in the work that there's that expectation for precision.
Yeah.
And sometimes we get so lucky with the builders and we learn so much from them and I think it shows when it's that precision is not just us, it's like the builder, because unfortunately we can't be there every single day. I wish, like, I would love to be there every day and just watch, because so many things can go wrong. But yeah, I think there's so much craftsmanship that they do bring, and trusting them once you can recognize it and they recognize what you're after. I think it's really lovely when it's there, but not always.
So if you don't have like a builder you always work with, this is more than one.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever worked with the same builder even. I think it's because, you know, our projects are kind of spread out like around, so it's hard to.
Yeah, even in LA, like we can't get someone to come to the west side if they
Yeah.
only work on the east side, and it's just, yeah.
I think it's super amazing. Looking at this kind of common denominator, maybe it's kind of lingua franca, the Batten. And I was thinking, these are my people. But it's also it's a couple of things at once. It's a rejection of continuity of service. And also kind of a hedge against uncertainty and kind of the variability of craft. But I'm wondering how, it seems like this kind of intuition has now been kind of baked into the way you approach services and kind of the kind of exterior, the sort of envelope and the relationship of the building to the landscape. So wondering if you wanted to just talk about that a little bit in terms of how you see these buildings that are all very different coming together with these, kind of similar strategies for making things.
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing that we've learned is if you can establish a material that can only be done in one way, or there's like limitations to what the material can do and what the detail can do. You don't need to draw every single thing, because, for example, the standing seam, everything is just standing seam. So there's not a lot of room for misinterpretation, because it's not, 4 different materials or 15 different materials coming together. So less things can go wrong. And so we really like when there's that the material or like the rhythms or however we're implementing those things can introduce some rigor that's not it's just inherent into the design or to the material.
I've lived with my in-laws twice now. Because they use the idea of the 10-foot, but also it's very rewarding in other ways. I'm curious on those projects, which I imagine may happen a lot more in the future. Are you dealing with 2 sets of clients at the same time? Can you just share some strategies on how you manage that?
Yeah. It's funny, like who's on what emails, like who gets CC'd on this one and who doesn't. You kind of like, it feels like you figure out who's in charge of what, and there usually isn't much overlap. So you can kind of figure that out early on. You're going to talk to this person about this, and you're going to talk to this person about this. There hasn't been a lot of like butting heads, because it feels like each party has their own interest. So.
Yeah, I mean, we've been around some awkward arguments and I mean, but there has been some moments.
Yeah.
But I think that's just the design process, like that, like we're working through it with the clients. It's like everyone's trying to figure it out. And, we have that kind of, probably conflict just between the two of us and kind of working through things. And, it's not a bad thing. It's good. We don't want someone to just sit there and not say anything. That's actually like the worst experience, because you're not getting the feedback, and it's really difficult. And the houses are a very personal thing, and so we kind of want the conflict and the kind of disagreements and the different opinions, and we feel like it makes the projects better. We really like the Los Osos house because there was just this layer of the client's health that really shaped how some of the stuff was organized and where the priorities were. And we're always trying to get, like dig in and get all that information out of the person so that you can like do something with it.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out the evolution of your experiences perhaps with Greg and Frank, speaking like the way in which the decision that Greg was talking about, how you can do to a certain scale and degree through low-tech means accomplish the kinds of things that we think of in high-tech context, like tolerances and, certain kind of detailing. And while for now, maybe you only have one type of project, it's pretty obvious to me that soon you will expand to commercial and other kinds of projects. And, maybe it's not kind of like a crystal ball kind of question, but I'm trying to imagine how the project evolves as projects might get bigger, or the kind of palette of materials needs to expand to absorb, structure or even a different context. I still see kind of that initial suspicion that California is a gravitational sort of center for the projects, not only because of the landscape or the available craft or the material, environmental conditions, et cetera, et cetera. I was trying to imagine that sort of expert. So my question was, at the same time that you do all of these projects that are client-based at the building scale, you seem to have going on some projects like, like the joint project that are smaller scale, perhaps not self-motivated. Are you ever doing, for example, competitions for, large building work, speculative work outside of California? I'm very interested in how some of these ideas translate or don't translate, or how the project is forced to be transformed, the pressures of even shifting from that context.
We haven't done any competitions. I know there's one that's very intriguing to us, and I also think like we're a product of like an era that we went to school where everyone was working in a very international way, and it was like the era of like the Starchitect and everyone was working everywhere and doing lots of different things. And I think we just wanted to go the opposite direction and see what that did, and kind of just simplifying things. I mean, we really couldn't, like when we started our practice, we just really couldn't relate to that scale of building. It just felt, unrelatable. And so even like working at Frank's, but looking at his earlier work, and that was so much more appealing to us, and kind of studying the early houses and the early commercial spaces and the galleries and things like that. And absolutely, we're not tied down to California. We would go we're totally open to that. But there's also something about trying to just like really get to know a place and be good at that. And we love, like Clinton Marr. It was really interesting, like learning about him. He was educated in LA, but then he moved to Riverside and decided to just do good architecture there. And there's a lot of documentation about his stuff, but he's not, a household name amongst the modernists of LA. but we really respect that approach that he went there and did good work. We're at the place that needed it. So yeah, I mean, our conversation is always like, should we move to Carpinteria? Should we move to Santa Barbara? Is that like,
Should we go even smaller?
yeah.
Chapters 2, 3, or 4. So much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
so much, everyone.